Hello my fiery friends, the Infernoman here with the latest in budget deck technology. And for today's deck tech, we're going to be jumping into our series of super ultra budget deck techs. That means you do not need a single rare or mythic to build this. You can save those for future decks, because today we're going to be playing a deck that allows you to grind out your opponent by doing some life gain and drain shenanigans, sacrificing for value, and basically providing a bunch of mid-range power for basically nothing really.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off.
So without further ado, let's jump into our deck today that we are calling basically Sacrifice. But before we continue, if you do like any of the content that I do, please like, follow, and subscribe wherever you watch the content so you don't miss out on any of the gameplay, booster pack openings, deck decks, and so much more. Whether you're a first-time viewer of the channel or you're a long-time viewer, you know how we have to do it. We have to talk about the stats of the deck before we jump right into it. So, our deck today is looking at an average mana curve of about 2.0. We are mono black, and we're playing 24 creatures, specifically 4 instants, 4 sorceries, 8 enchantments, and 20 lands. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, we are trying to sacrifice some of our creatures for immediate value to hopefully gain some more cards or to drain out our opponent.
But when I'm in command, every mission's a suicide mission.
How are we going to do that, you may wonder? Well, let's go ahead, let's cover some of those cards now. So, starting with the creatures of the deck, we're going to be talking about again in the 1-drop slot, Foulmire Knight. Again, it has a 1/1 Death Toucher. Also, you can then play its instant ability, which is an adventure, to draw a card and lose 1 life. Great card for any part of the game. Shambling Gas here is also going to provide you immediate value when it dies. You can either get -1/-1 on a creature till end of turn, or you can create a treasure token. 9 times out of 10, you're definitely going to want to create that treasure token, so that way you can start casting more stuff sooner. In the 2-drop slot, as far as another reoccurring creature that you can take advantage of, it will be Reassembling Skeleton. I know, some people out there may underestimate this card a lot and may prefer other things at the 2-drop slot, but trust me, this card for a beginner deck is great because as you can see, when it does die, you can always cast it again from 2 from the graveyard to bring it back to the battlefield tapped. Remember, this also means that you don't have to do that sorcery speed, so you can do it really at the end of an opponent's end step in order to ensure you get maximum value out of the card. As far as our other creature, that'll be Zulaport Cutthroat here. This card, of course, is going to be your main workhorse here. Zulaport Cutthroat here is a 2-mana 1/1 human rogue ally. Whenever Zulaport Cutthroat or another creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. This should hopefully give you an idea of, again, how we're going to take advantage of our creatures. Again, our creatures aren't doing that much damage, but this will help speed up the clock greatly against our opponent. As far as the 3-drop slot for creatures, you'll have Fellstinger here. This card has Death Touch. It comes into the battlefield with the Exploit ability, meaning that, again, you'll have to sacrifice a creature to trigger the exploit. But if you do, you'll lose 2 life, but you'll get to gain 2 cards out of that deal. And then in the 4-drop slot, this may look a little awkward since it's technically not as efficient as some of our other sacrifice fodder, but Death Preach of Merkle here is a great card. And the top end here, this 4-mana Tiefling Cleric is a 2/2 that says skeletons, vampires, and zombies you control get +1/+1. At the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, you may pay 1, and if you do, you create a 1/1 black skeleton creature token. With the buff, of course, this technically means that skeleton will be a 2/2 as long as this priest stays on the battlefield. This is, of course, your top end curve here, which will help you, of course, pump up your creatures, give them a little bit more push to ensure that you can get to victory, and also technically this will help us out with another card we'll talk about in just a second. But with the creatures out of the way, now I'll explain to you, of course, the brief support that you'll utilize taking advantage of the sacrifice abilities. In 1-drop slot, you'll have Eaten Alive here. Yes, there are going to be some more efficient and faster removal, but trust me, in the era right now that we're currently in, there's a lot of cards that don't mind being in the graveyard. So we have to exile them instead, and also this will take care of planeswalkers for us. You can pay the 4 mana completely if you have to, but ideally you want to be as super efficient and then sacrifice your creatures for value while also taking advantage of how efficient this card is. And our other 1-drop support card is Village Rites. We could sacrifice a creature basically to draw 2 cards. Again, don't be afraid to sacrifice when you need to get some more action out of your deck. For the 2-drop support, you'll have Ghoulish Procession here. This enchantment allows us to then create some decayed zombies that are 2/2s. Remember that again, with decayed, this basically means that the creature can't block, and when it attacks, you have to sacrifice it at the end of combat. You can, of course, take advantage of this card even when it is done attacking. Remember that again, while that trigger will go on the stack for when it sacrifices itself at the end of combat, you can then take advantage of the fact that you have Village Rites here to sacrifice it for additional value, getting more value out of the token. Also, this will technically trigger off Deathpreach of Merkle because, again, while that creature dies, you can then turn it into a 1/1 black skeleton creature token, which actually can block. Just keep that in mind, of course. And then your only other final support piece, of course, will be Bastion of Remembrance, similar to Zulaport Cutthroat, except it's for an additional mana, and it's an enchantment. It enters the battlefield and gives us a human soldier creature token, which we could take advantage of sacrificing later on. However, it does more of the life gain and drain that Zulaport Cutthroat does, and it's a little bit harder to get rid of because it is an enchantment. But otherwise, that's the whole deck for you. As far as your mana base is concerned, since we are a budget deck that's focused on trying to make this as beginner and simple as possible, we're only going to rock 20 swamps. That's basically all you need. Now, as far as strategy for this deck is concerned, you're basically going to want to focus, of course, on the early game aggro plan. Use your Foulmire Knights if you have to. Don't feel like you have to absolutely keep them just to take advantage of the adventure ability. Think of that as more as a mid to late game option if you just need to get some more card draw. Shambling Gas, of course, will get you to those Bastions of Remembrance as soon as possible, even as early as turn 2. And of course, the other biggest advantage, of course, is Reassembling Skeleton can constantly come back even after it gets destroyed from the graveyard back to the battlefield. With this, you ideally will be able to trigger off Ghoulish Procession a couple of times, get a couple of those extra zombies with Decayed. Even though they can't really block, they're still decent for aggro plans, especially when you do have that Zulaport Cutthroat out or the Bastion of Remembrance, to ensure that you can keep draining out your opponent little by little. As you get to the mid and late game against your opponents, this is where again the deck really shines, because most of the time when your opponent is going to focus on trying to remove your creatures, this is where you can take advantage of your village rights to then start sacking for more card draw to dig into more action. If you are dealing with sometimes more trickier creatures, this is when your Eaten Alive can come into play. This is of course with the fact that Fell Stinger also has Death Touch, and also in the Exploit ability can also help you draw into more action, and it gives you a bigger body on top of that. Same thing as I mentioned earlier with the Foulmire Knight. You can use it still in the late game because it still is a 1/1 creature that still has Death Touch, which can provide you a little bit more to block your opponent. And then finally, of course, at the top end, as we mentioned at the beginning of the video, Death Priest of Merkel here is a great way to finish because it pumps up all of your weaker creatures with giving them just enough power so you can just push through a little extra damage. But again, its final ability where you can then pay to make some skeleton creature tokens can technically upgrade your decayed zombies into skeletons that at least can provide some decent blockers when you need to close out the game further. Also, one of the other cute tricks you can pull off with the deck is remember that with cards like Fell Stinger, you actually don't have to draw cards to lose life for your own. If you are trying to close out the game and maybe you have an opponent that's almost there, you can force them to draw some cards and make them lose 2 life if that really can help you close out the game as well. But otherwise, if you do like this style of deck in any way, shape, or form, just acknowledge, of course, that one of the biggest weaknesses to the deck is if your opponent can keep away your Bastion of Remembrance or they can keep your Zulaport Cutthroats off of the battlefield, you're going to have a hard time with this deck. And the other major thing that really screws us over here is any cards that force our creatures into exile. Because remember, with exile effects, that will not trigger off Zulaport Cutthroat or Bastion of Remembrance. So just keep that in mind, and sometimes you might have to do on knee-jerk reaction of Village Rights just to sacrifice and gain a little bit of value if your opponent attempts to wrath the board, or even at worst, exile the whole board. Just keep that in mind, of course, with that. But with that out of the way, here are going to be my final thoughts on this deck overall. For those of you, again, who maybe are fans of maybe Zombie Tribal, or maybe you're a fan of life gain and drain shenanigans, this is obviously going to be the deck for you. Is it going to be the fastest, most efficient version of it? Not at all. However, remember that, again, these videos are designed to make you build something that you can help make into something in the future that you can see on screen right now. I do have other variants of these style of decks that I've done over the years, which do add in some rares and mythics. So if you are interested in this type of gameplay, be sure to check out some of my other past videos. Yes, some of them are maybe slightly outdated, but it doesn't hurt to take a little look at it anyway and see what you can do, maybe if you are interested in buffing it up for your own future deck. I had a lot of fun building this deck. Again, I really do have a passion for building these super ultra budget decks for new beginner players out there, and for players that really don't want to spend any mythics or rares, at least until they know for sure they want to build something that they're going to commit to. But if you are otherwise a fan of sacking for value, if you like mid-range style of decks where you can just outgrind your opponent no matter how much they try to force through damage to you, if you are a person that is tired of playing against hyper aggro or hyper control decks, I would definitely say give this deck a try. Even for those of you who are beginners out there, for those of you who are still playing ultra budget, there is definitely a core here that you can work with, that you can build up to something stronger. But even if you play it as is, I assure you, you'll still have a lot of fun doing so, and you will definitely not be disappointed. That's all I have for you today. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and just remember that no matter what you do play in the game of life, always be sure to burn bright. Later.